they swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally had attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie we've been exploring the history of the military orders and the Crusades. In this final episode we're going to have an overview of all that we've been discussing, which takes us over more than 1,000 years of history, and also looking at the way we view the Crusades today, whether we're right to view them in the way that we do, how history beyond us might view them, and what implications and messages there are from the Crusades to today. Which is quite a big agenda, isn't it? Let's go back over some history first, shall we?
Well, that is the thing we have to remember, of course, is that we're talking about a very large chunk of Christian history. And if we're just going to dismiss it, then we're dismissing a very large chunk of Christian history. I mean, it goes really from the beginning of the rise of Islam in the early 600s, right the way through to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and beyond, up at least to the French Revolution. And the ideals, as we see, continue on long after the crusading image is a matter of history.
And it's connected with the tension, Christianity and Islam, and also the shaping of Christianity as it's been shaped by some of the people involved in the Crusades, heroes and villains alike, shaping all our history. But I think it's interesting to...
What we also see now is an increasingly secularist view of Christian history and indeed of Muslim history. We see, for example, some of the film productions and books that are produced, these are really based upon the Enlightenment propaganda about the Crusades. So you see a film like The Kingdom of Heaven, for example, which has a lot of historically accurate elements to it, but with a hugely prejudiced slant and a lot of inaccurate historical additions. And this is because a later view of the Crusades has been handed down rather than the reality of what actually happened.
Yes, I was very interested in the thesis put forward by Professor Jonathan Riley-Smith, who's of course an excellent historian on the Crusades and whose books are sort of must read on this. Cambridge University, gave a lecture to the Catholic Writers Guild a while back, in which he said the 19th century vision of the Crusades that was taught in Britain and elsewhere and written about, for example, in school textbooks, was to try to use the crusading image as a way of justifying British colonial and other European, but let's say British colonial expansion into Africa. Now, this wasn't entirely wrong because it gave a noble gloss to it. But this vision of the Crusades, repudiated now by us, everybody is very anti the colonial adventure, was accepted by many Islamic readers and is still studied by them, and they assume that's what we still think. So they think we're all hurrahing for the Crusades, when in fact we're doing just the reverse. We're watching films like Kingdom of Heaven, which denounce the Crusades.
I think it's an interesting thesis of Professor Riley-Smith. And I think there's a lot in it. Both sides of the once religious divide, in a sense, have been sold the Enlightenment version of the Crusades, and are both barking up the wrong tree. The reality, historically speaking, is that this was a defensive war against an offensive operation launched by Islamic leaders with the aim of conquering Christian Europe. A rather different view from the sort of colonialist aggression view. And as we've seen throughout this series, that is the simple historical fact of it.
It's interesting that because in the 19th century people wanted to use the Crusades to give a romantic gloss, if you like, to their own adventures, not wholly wrongly. I mean, there was this beauty and nobility of purpose in many of the crusading soldiers. We've seen the heroism of the Knights Templar. But because the Victorians liked to see themselves as this, and even more the German Kaiser, the Hohenzollern Kaiser, sort of striding into Jerusalem in a white uniform, made them feel very good. But it was a complete distortion of the Crusade. Nevertheless, that is the view that many Islamic people of the modern generation have absorbed because there was such dominance of literature.
Also partly because they themselves were, in fact, part of these colonialist empires. They were the subject peoples.
Using those textbooks, as it were.
Having been themselves the rulers of these territories, in the 19th century we then get a colonialist aggressive, in some respects, aggressive invasion for all sorts of reasons. They then become a subject people, and they imbibe this Enlightenment view of the Crusades. So, in a sense, it's important for the future of world peace that we get a proper understanding of the Crusades rather than this distorted view that has been put about since the 19th century, or indeed since the Enlightenment. And we need to re-evaluate the Crusades to see what really actually happened. Yes, it's true they were wars of religion, but we have to ask ourselves, were those wars of religion, which essentially consisted of defending the frontier zones, any the worse than nationalist or indeed racially motivated wars that came later? I think there's no question that the later nationalist and racist wars were much worse, quite apart from anything else. There was a great deal more loss of civilian life in those later wars than there ever was in the Crusades. Yet if you read a lot of the commentators who depend upon the Enlightenment view, you'd think it was the other way around.
Yes, there is this slightly silly thing where we all denounce the wars in the Crusades as being religious wars, but some of the great tragedies of the 19th century, for example, the Crimean War and Boer War and so on, where much loss of life, much tragedy. Think of the Crimean War and Florence Nightingale's nurses trying to deal with the appalling conditions and so on. Why is that somehow all right because it wasn't a religious war? This is absolute nonsense.
Well, even more obvious, of course, is the First and Second World Wars, not religious wars. Great deal more loss of life, including civilian life. And, of course, after the fall of the last Catholic empire, the Austrian Empire, which is itself the rump of the Holy Roman Empire, which itself was the centre of the old Catholic Empire and Christendom, what do we see? It falls, and we see the rise of communism, we see the rise of Nazism, and nobody can be in any doubt that the wars that those two ideologies created resulted in a hugely greater number of deaths of innocent people than ever happened in any of the wars of religion.
And I think this interesting thing about the Crusades is the understanding of the geopolitical reality of Europe, and that European Christianity was fundamentally not regarded as a racially important thing. It was the beliefs of Christianity that mattered. And the Crusaders' battles, as we have seen, were tempered by this attempt to do it in a Christian way. So where you get a crusading mob ranting into a city and slaughtering people, you get the Pope trying to rein that in and excommunicating
not only the Pope, but also the political leaders. Because where you tended to get atrocities happening, this was an unauthorised mob. Of course, there were some events that happened by the official forces, if you like, even by some of the military religious orders. But this, by comparison, is tiny. And, of course, by comparison with the atrocities that come later, for example, in the 19th and 20th centuries, it's very small beer, really.
I think it's important that we understand this and also look at the...
I mean, I don't want to minimise atrocities. Plainly, atrocities are always wrong. But I do think we should see it in perspective.
And I also think one of the things you learn from the Crusades is which we've seen also in modern times, is the appalling horror of the mob when they get an idea and how that can get out of control. We're all aware of that.
And I think, to be fair to our to Muslim leaders, quite often there are mobs that get out of control, and the leadership can be blamed for that. And that again would be an unfair judgment.
Yes, this is an important point to realise about the way human beings work.
But I think we've got to remember that this idea that the whole thing was an imperialist expedition is simply not founded upon the historical facts. Yes, of course, there was an empire. There was a Holy Roman Empire. There was, if you like, the kingdom of Christ on earth, Christendom, and all the ideas associated with that. But the truth and reality is expressed in that wonderful little Latin apophthegm about the Holy Roman Empire, in which it is said, Ali bella gerent, tu Felix Austria, nubes. Others make war, but thou, O happy Austria, only marry, or to put it in modern parlance, they make war, you make love. Mm-hmm. And the reality of this was that the dynasty that ruled certainly in the later Austrian Empire, advanced itself by marital, dynastic joinders, by marriage, and not by conquest. The Austrian Empire notoriously, famously, unlike many another European empire-building project in the 19th century, had no empire except by marriage.
One of the things that then emerged in the 19th century, of course, was the new German Empire under the Hohenzollerns, under Prussia.
That was a very different
thing. And with Bismarck and so on, centred on Berlin. And then you have the emergence of that Prussian nationalism. When we talk of the Kaiser, we tend to say the Kaiser, meaning Kaiser Wilhelm and the Prussian Empire, First World War.
We tend to speak of the Kaiser meaning the Protestant Kaiser,
yes, we don't
not
use
the Catholic Kaiser.
One. Yeah, that's right.
And the 19th century saw the gradual eclipse of the Catholic Kaiser and the rise of the Protestant Kaiser. And it is interesting that it rose in the Prussian territories, that part of Europe that had once been so savagely pagan and had to be contained by the crusading order of the Teutonic Knights, now have become ascendant, have become Christian, and then seems to revert to a kind of militaristic outlook on life with the rise of the Prussian-German Empire.
Well, it is rather a tragedy as we look at the good people spilling their blood in two great world wars, and of course in which our own country played such a big role, and where again there is the nobility of people laying down their lives and also the overriding tragedy of war. There are all sorts of concrete things that, going back to the Crusaders, that they left us behind. I'm thinking first of that image of the crusading soldier and the beautiful but heartbreaking memorials of the First World War, where they had this image of the crusader. And although one thinks it's all very cruel somehow, we think of the gorgeous young men slaughtered on the Western Front, that nobility was very beautiful.
Yes, it was. But I think that was the beginning of the propaganda age, in which the image of the crusader is turned to a very nationalistic outlook. And I think that tends to put the wrong construction on what actually the Crusades were about. I think there are a lot of good things that come out that inure to the present day, and we have to recognise the historical roots within the Crusades. Hospitals, the idea of chivalry itself, of rules in war, protecting the weak, of the Red Cross even, for example, advances in medicine, which happened at that time, advances in diplomacy and the making of treaties. Let's forget that St. Louis and indeed the Templars and Hospitallers themselves, whenever there was an opportunity, would make a treaty with Islam and the Muslim leaders, with the aim, obviously, of achieving peace. The idea that this was just one long bloodletting without end is simply not true either. It was out of these a sort of clash of civilizations, we nonetheless got a lot of tremendous benefits, which benefited both Islam and Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom as a whole, and future Western civilization.
And despite the fact that it was done in the context of war, you also got a certain cross-cultural thing, exchange of ideas on all sorts of aspects of mathematics and philosophy and ideas. Even though it was done in the worst possible circumstances, there was, to that extent, a meeting of the Islamic and Christian minds. And then, going back to the military orders, you have the concept of orders of chivalry, which of course exists to this day. And we have that in our own country, knighthood, the various orders, such as the Order of the Garter, given to this day in the name of God, Our Lady and St. George. So there is at least this concept of the chivalric order, even if it's not done in...
That undoubtedly comes directly out of the Crusades. I mean, not to say you didn't have those sorts of things before. You had them in the Roman Empire. You almost certainly had them before the Roman Empire. But they were developed in a particular direction, predicated upon chivalric ideals, that you start to get these orders of chivalry, which, of course, as you say, inure to this day. I mean, even here in America, the Congressional Medal of Honor, all that kind of ideal comes out of the same root within the concept of chivalry.
I'm always interested when you have the ceremony for the Order of the Garter that everybody loves it, and we say to one another it's just for the tourists, but the image of a monarch emerging from a church to give this thing, there is something rather marvellous about that. It's on St George's Day and the Guard of Honour is provided by the Scouts. There is something going on here which strikes a deep chord as a calling to something noble, even if it's only some retired politician who's been given the honour, perhaps,
Well, yes, I mean, honours that may be given for all sorts of spurious and dubious reasons, but the ideals underneath them are not tarnished thereby. And the other thing that we have to remember is that whilst it's unquestionable that there was a huge clash of civilizations, that both civilizations have learnt from the past, and indeed other civilizations as well. And I think that an understanding of the truth of what actually happened will help and assist to develop the relations between the Islamic world and the West. And I mean, for myself, I remember when I was at military academy in Britain, I had opposite me and on the right of me, as a cadet, two future Islamic leaders. One an emir, one a sheikh, or will be, in two of the Gulf states. And I mean, this is, I think, an image of how things perhaps could move in the future, so that we can have a better understanding and better relations between the Islamic world and the Western world.
And I remember you were good friends with these people, not least because you were all having to polish boots and march around on parade grounds and so on. I think, too, there is within the church a recognition, especially in a shrinking world, the media and everything making us all talk to one another, that there are possibilities for making common cause in defence of human values. And you and I and others have seen this also with our Islamic friends. When there is some useful project we can all do together, you have people whose Islamic understanding of God and some kind of sense of service to humanity, we can unite together against a massively secularist or selfish or greedy consumerist view of life, when the only thing that matters is making money, eating what we like and doing exactly what we like in our personal relationships.
Yes, and a loss of all restraint which comes about by the discipline which religion imposes. And once you fall away into the kind of secularism which is so much on the rise, you lose that sense of self-discipline and even of self-respect, which both the Christian and the Muslim worlds have maintained.
One thinks then of Pope John Paul being given this extraordinarily rousing response when he addressed a young Islamic gathering, an absolutely extraordinary achievement, and that was a marvellous thing. And then the great warmth when Pope Benedict XVI went to Turkey. And one can reflect with some concern that some of the warmth and enthusiasm that we saw may not always be reflected in so-called Christian countries, where you will have people also within the church denouncing Pope John Paul. I remember when he went to the Netherlands, there was some real concern and so on. And you hear the most dreadful things said about the Pope, not by Islamic people, but by people professing to be Catholic.
Yeah, and I think even at the height of the crusading battles, there was a kind of mutual respect brought about by an understanding of man in relation to God, which doesn't now exist. And this is much more troubling. I mean, one only has to look at the atheist and secularist ideologies of communism and Nazism to see what happens when man departs altogether from God. However bad things were in the Crusades between Christians and Muslims, it was as nothing compared with the sheer godless savagery of communism or Nazism.
Solzhenitsyn said that people were saying in the Gulag, this is because man has forgotten God, this idea that there is no restraint at all on our behaviour. And then you can count in the millions the victims of that, and carried out with this ghastly savagery that there is no judge. We will never meet anyone who sees all our actions, counts every deed. And that is such a ghastly scenario, and we have lived through that, human beings have lived through that in the 20th century, that the idea that there is an ultimate justice, that there is a God of justice and mercy, is at least a temporary... It's a restraint.
On the worst of human behaviour. And interestingly, I mean, there was a certain and clear mutual respect between some of the crusading leaders when they saw the example set by somebody like Salah ad-Din, who was a great Muslim general, and whilst he was certainly aiming at conquering Christian lands, he was in a very different category of person from the kind of godless secularists of the communist and Nazi stamp. Very, very different man altogether, and much in many ways respected by his Crusader enemies, as indeed he himself respected the Templars. I mean, he made sure that he defeated them because he feared their discipline and their cohesion. But there was nonetheless a mutual respect which is just lacking with the secular mind.
This is exemplified in the probably legendary story, but a nice one, of Saladin sending snows from the mountains to cool the fevered brow of the wounded crusaders. And Richard the Lionheart, whose statue, of course, stands outside Parliament, sword upraised outside the Palace of Westminster, there was this image of Richard the Lionheart on the one side and Saladin on the other, and there was this, and certainly there was an exchange of medical information.
Yes, I mean, I think there's, again, you have to be careful of the nationalist propaganda, but what is clear is that St. Louis, let's look at the saints rather than the less saintly crusaders, was himself, whenever he had the opportunity, entered into treaties and truces with his Islamic enemies, as also did the Templars and Hospitallers. The aim ultimately, of course, was peace, not aggression or war for its own sake, at least on the Christian side. There is no question that there was an aggressive intent on the part of some of the Muslim leaders, which is why a defensive posture had to be adopted by the West. But at the same time, there were common elements. And let us not forget that in the First World War, the Austrian Empire actually had an alliance with the Ottoman Turks. Of course, the Ottoman Turks by then were pretty much a spent force compared with what they had been. But there you had an example where, in very changed and different circumstances, you had not only cooperation but an alliance.
Yes, although it wasn't necessarily a very good thing.
Well, but it shows the possibilities.
It shows the possibilities. But what I was going to look at now is the way Islam views the West. And there's a particular interesting thing here for Christians, and not just Catholics but all Christians, because we somehow need to show that our values are not necessarily those of the worst of the West. There is something to be said about an Islamic view of the West, which sees our pornography, our really gross pornographic images on TV and elsewhere, idiot soap operas, relentless consumerism, destruction of marriage, contempt for the marital vow, destruction of the unborn, of course, promotion of same-sex marriage. And somehow we have to say, this is not our West. As Christians, we have to say, this is not our West. We have another vision, which includes service and care for the poor and families putting their marriage vows before other tensions and so on, which is not a voice that's very easy to convey.
And I think that is you would find a very clear echo of those sorts of concerns with many of the modern Islamic leaders. I think of the Emir of Qatar and the Sheikha. She is they're a very wealthy family, but they fund Al Jazeera, and this is clearly a very different form of outlook on life than the secularist outlook, which dominates so many parts of the West. Conversely, it is also very different from the extremist Islamic view, which is still around, let's not pretend otherwise, but which tends to represent the kind of threat which the Crusaders faced at the time of the Crusades. And when you see that in proper context and understand it, you then see that the view that one has to take of those crusading wars is rather different from the view that's put forward by the cynical anti-Christian secularist Enlightenment, but is also very different from the harnessing of the crusading ideal for pure nationalist propaganda purposes.
I think there's a sense, too, in which Christians in the West do feel rather beleaguered. We feel that our values are not necessarily reflected in our mass media or in the policies of much of our governments. So we somehow need to convey this to people who are living with Islam, who say, well, at least our view is superior to yours. And we have to say, well, it depends what you mean by, yours. What is the West? Because the Christian ideas are not necessarily those of the advertisers or the pop industry. We live within the West and we benefit and we like being part of our culture, but we can see its many faults.
And I think also we have to, it's a rather trite saying perhaps, but there is, I think, a lot of truth in it. Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. So it is in the interests of the present world and the interests of world peace that we understand the historical developments that went before, and we understand them properly, not in the sense that they are used purely to be harnessed for propaganda, but in their essence and in their truth, so we know the origins of where we are today.
And another thing is that truth has its own value. Even if some of the history of the Crusades makes us as Christians feel uncomfortable, you know, the mob getting out of hand, people being cruel to some group as they march through and they never make it to the Holy Land because they're too busy massacring somebody else on the way, may not be pleasant. But the real large truth, we've got nothing to be frightened of the fact.
Well, indeed, and we've got to see these things in context. We can't say because person A did something bad, then all the group from whom he comes are equally bad.
And not only that, the overview of the Crusades as a defense...
That cuts both ways, by the way.
It cuts both ways.
It's also something that one must apply with equal fairness to one's opponents.
Yes, and the whole of the truth of the Crusades, as they shaped the battles, the noble things that arose, is interesting. It's worthy of study. It's worth getting to the truth. It's worth finding out what really happened, which battles were fought, by whom and where.
And then we also we should look at, again, the really noble ideals. And I'm thinking now, for example, the Knights Hospitaller, if we go back to their ideal of serving the poorest of the poor, of the rich, wealthy noblemen of Europe, the powerful, serving the poorest of the poor as if they were Christ. And this is plainly an ideal which endures and will endure and must endure. It's one that we see exemplified in somebody like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, if you like. She is a person who exemplifies Christian chivalry at its best.
And these are images that we will not know about unless we study the history and relate it to the present day. And the worst thing will be a sort of mental laziness that accepts the modern version of propaganda. Final thought is that I think longer-term history may take a different view from that of the 21st century about the Crusades. It may well be in 10, 50, 100 years' time, people will have a more accurate view of the Crusades. Our current propaganda one, the film you mentioned, might be regarded as silly rubbish. Just as the Da Vinci Code is.
Indeed.
We've been looking at the military orders in the Crusades. We hope you found this enjoyable. Lots more to study on it, isn't there? The military orders and the Crusades.